Welcome to the LowCarbUSA podcast, where we seek to inspire you to help us build this community. I'm Doug Reynolds.
And this is Pam Devine.
Okay, so I have Dr. Carl Goldkamp and Dr. Robert Cywes with us here today. And we've all just come from a very successful event in Boca a couple of weeks ago. And something came up there that we felt like we needed to expand on a bit. Dr. Del Height did an awesome talk about standard of care and the fact that really required a consensus. And then she went on to describe a little bit about what consensus was and the fact that didn't mean that we all agreed about everything. She basically said that we agree on some of the core principles, but we may differ on certain things, and agreeing to disagree is still a consensus. And we're never all going to agree on everything, but that healthy debate around these contentious points enables all of us to move forward and learn more. Mm-hmm. So something came up at the event where Rob said something and Carl didn't totally agree or understand what he was saying. In that context of Q&A session or whatever, in the event, we didn't have time to expand on anything. And so I decided it would be a really good chance for us to sit down and do a podcast like this where we would have the time. And I normally do keep my things to 20 minutes. But as anybody who's listened to any of our stuff with Rob Cywes, he can never say anything in 20 minutes. And I also don't feel like I want to stop this conversation, just shut it down. So if it runs for longer or much longer, which I anticipate it will, then so be it. So maybe, Carl, if you could just frame your concern initially, and then we can kind of take the discussion from there.
Yeah, okay. So I was an attendee, not a speaker. And so I believe Dr. Cywes said in asking a question on day number 2 that protein goes to sugar. And there's probably a larger context around that comment, but that's not something I accept as fact. And I'm coming from not just sort of saying academic. My background is a naturopathic doctor, so it's seeing patients as well. And so we have patients come through, use CGMs, do their blood work, now glucagon, actually primarily from you last year, Rob. And so we do pretty complete, following, ketometer, blood work, and their glucometer. And so when I look at that statement, it's not a black or white, it's very dependent. And part of that is I've been trying to say what you said is true in some of the cases, but it's not true in the majority of the cases. So the question goes up. And so that's why I say I disagree with that. It's not based on my experience. And then secondarily, if we want to use Dr. Benjamin Beichman, an academician, he's had some interesting comments about that. He comes from a whole different place. He doesn't see patients. He'll be the first to admit it. So between those two, and if I was to go deeper, I would say that there's probably other support for that. But I would say it's primarily from my experience saying that hasn't been true. So I can't make it true when it hasn't been mapped out to be true. So, but I will also say, because we've had some exchanges through email, that it is classic medical school physiology to say that protein goes to sugar. It's also part of the basic classic ketogenic diet. They were worried, they kept the protein down for the glycemic effect. So I understand that context. That's not a new idea. I'm saying that I've stopped believing in dogma a long time ago. And part of that, to the degree I can prove it to myself and my experience of patients and so on, then I go, well, it said that ABC. In this case, it said that, protein does convert into glucose for a variety of reasons. The amino acid alanine, certainly top of the list, but not all of them. But that's even a rabbit hole. So that's where I think if we get clarity, we'll probably come to a meeting point about, yes, it is, but I think we need blood work in the conversation and we need greater specificity. So I think these are great positions to have.
Okay, I thank you for that, Carl. And I think it is a one-liner and it is a little oversimplified, but I will stick to it and use graphics, use evidence to prove my point. However, let's clarify one thing. Protein is unlike carbohydrates, which are pretty much exclusively used for their caloric value. Protein and fat are both used as a nutrient and for their caloric value. So if you look at protein as a nutrient, that is where, when you eat protein, so I'm talking about consuming animal protein or possibly plant protein, but all of the amino acids, the full spectrum of 20 or so amino acids that human beings that human beings eat from meat. That's the substrate called protein. And when you eat a protein load, it can go into 3 different directions. The nutrient direction, which I'm not talking about, is where it goes down a pathway toward muscles, towards cellular proteins, towards enzymes, and towards hormones. I'm not talking about that, and clearly some protein that we eat at various levels is used for tissue repair, tissue construction, that kind of thing. When you look at the spectrum of amino acids, when they're used for energy, so now we're talking about the energy block, there are 3 types of proteins, 3 types of amino acids. And when I say protein, I mean amino acids. There are 2 pure ketogenic amino acids. I think a leucine and isoleucine. There are some pure gluconeogenic or glucose amino acids, and then there are some amino acids, the majority of them, that can go both ways, either toward ketones or toward sugar. So they can go toward fat or sugar, and so therefore, based upon the general hormonal milieu of the body, when you talk about specifically about the energy side, the body will triage proteins either toward a ketogenic pathway or to a gluconeogenic pathway. Now we're going to focus on the glucose. Does that make sense? You following me along here? Okay. So, and depending on whether somebody's in ketosis or in glucosis, whether they're using sugar as their primary fuel source or fat, that'll triage it to a certain extent. And I'm doing the opposite. I love Ben, but I'm doing the opposite of what he does. I'm starting at what we measure in the bloodstream and working backwards to how it got there, as opposed to him saying these hormones will most likely direct stuff to the bloodstream. And the statement I made is that protein becomes sugar is based upon a simple graphic. And Dad, I sent that graphic to you. It comes from a guy called Dr. Jake Kushner. And here it is here. I don't know if you've got that, Doug, if I can show it to you. But this is a type 1 diabetic who eats a protein load. And if you notice, the brown line is sugar. So when a type 1 diabetic eats pure protein, look at their blood sugar just go up and up and up and up. So that tells you that when you eat protein, it turns to sugar, period. And that's the proof that we're looking at. And when you talk to diabetics, or when you're teaching type 1 diabetics about how to eat protein, one of the critical things when a type 1, when a type 1 diabetic eats protein, the recommendation by endocrinologists and by myself is over here is a protein load. Where am I? Here's a protein load. And then you have to, or at least they teach type 1 diabetics to bolus with a little bit of insulin to dampen the gluconeogenic effect of that sugar. So in the absence of significant amounts of insulin, now all these diabetics typically are on a basal amount of insulin. In the absence of insulin, the liver will convert protein to sugar in an unabated fashion, to the point that they can actually become hyperglycemic, okay? So we know that's proof. Therefore, diabetics are told when they eat a protein load, they need to consume insulin. We know that. Now, let's flip across to a slightly different scenario. Let's look at somebody who is insulin resistant, whether they're diabetic or just obese, when they're insulin resistant. Under conditions of insulin resistance, when that person eats a huge amount of, or eats a protein load, exactly the same thing happens. The protein gets turned to sugar. And because there's a disconnect between insulin and glucagon, insulin's primary role in human beings is actually to regulate glucagon. And also, so what insulin does is as your blood sugar rises, insulin shuts off glucagon. That's what it should do. And it also shuts off lipoprotein lipase, which is the release of fat from the fat stores. And then insulin's minor role is to get sugar into the bloodstream. Under conditions of the standard American diet or insulin resistance, what happens is that sugar that is being produced from protein through gluconeogenesis in the liver, at first a little bit is stored as glycogen, which is a form of sugar, so protein being transferred to sugar, and then secondarily, some of that will spill over into the blood sugar, not as rampant as it is in the absence of insulin, although it can be pretty high. But on CGMs, people that are insulin resistant, their blood sugar will rise when they eat a pure protein load. Now, the protein load that I've tested this with is chicken breast and turkey, as lean an animal protein as you can get. And it requires insulin to shut off that gluconeogenic effect. And the paradox is for certain type 2 diabetics, there's such a disconnect, such a tremendous amount of insulin resistance between their insulin production and their glucagon that they have what they call paradoxical gluconeogenesis in the face of hyperinsulinemia. So that is, again, where protein is being converted to sugar and that system is not being shut off. It's a dysregulation. The third place we see this is in, and we've got several now that we've tested, and I've tested more since Doug raised this question with me, is in highly fat-adapted athletes. And what athletes do from a performance perspective is they consume huge amount of, a lot of athletes, the group that we're looking at are triathletes primarily, or distance athletes, who consume a huge amount of pure protein, either as a powder or as an amino acid mix, or as a very lean, non-fat protected. And the word I use is to protect your protein with fat. So these are people who do not consume fat with that protein. And in those people, while their blood sugar doesn't rise very high, they are not necessarily insulin resistant, at least not quantifiably insulin resistant, at least type 2 insulin resistance. What's the difference between type 1 and type 2 insulin resistance? Type 1 insulin resistance is where you get a significant rise in insulin release, but your blood sugar stays below 100. Type 2 is where you get, insulin resistance type 2 is where you get a rise in insulin and a rise in blood sugar. And these athletes do not see a rise in blood sugar, but when we get them to measure their insulin is through the roof relative to where it should be. So their pancreas is having to work really, really hard to control their blood sugar. Now, I'm going to go to one last slide, and this comes from a guy called Ben Bickman from his talk. And if you look at the end of his talk, what he talks about on protein is, this is kind of his slide over here. And I know it's upside down, but he says whenever, with people eating protein, he's talking about 1, maybe 2 grams of protein per kilo. You want to control that sugar, have an ultra low amount of sugar, have a significant amount of protein, but the biggest box is filling it with fat. And when you fill it with fat, the fat reduces the gluconeogenic pathway because you're in ketosis. So the statement I made at this talk was to protect protein by eating it with fat. And your ideal source is red meat. But a lot of people are afraid, a lot of newbies are afraid to eat significant fat. And under those insulin resistant conditions, those people eating a lot of lean protein go down that gluconeogenic pathway. And the issue with that for me is not so much just the sugar part that keeps them out of ketosis. The other issue with a lot of those proteins is they turn into uric acid, oxalic acid, purines, and pyrimidines. And the concern with that is things like keto rash, kidney stones, crystals in their joints, inflammatory crystals in their joints. So that's the context that I warn my patients not to eat lean protein unprotected by fat when they start a ketogenic diet.
Okay, thank you for that. So starting with type 1 and then type 2, those are very special cases, and those are not normal cases. So those are, I would say, pathophysiology. They do exist in the world, but I'm saying that if I had 2 people in front of me, because I like to do in the real world, I don't have room A, here's type 1, and room B, there's type 2. You know, you have to define. So insulin resistance, we're going to use the word hyperinsulinemia. So that's basically the level of insulin. What else can we define? So type 1 is obviously more or less devoid of insulin. So there's 2 very different cases, but they're not a normal person coming in. So if one is obese, let's say, if this is what we're talking about, some may be insulin resistant, some may not be insulin resistant, as you know as well. The pathways are interesting and everything you said is true. But what I'm saying is if I had two people in front of me and saying, women or guys or whoever, we're going to have your 4-ounce ribeye and your 4-ounce ribeye. So if we're just talking about protein, it's contrived. And you're saying, you know, Dr. Bickman, he's a researcher and doesn't work with people or whatever, something to that effect. It's like, well, people eat food. And yes, they can eat powdered protein and they can put it in their coffee and so on and so forth. Not talking about that. As I referenced in our emails, it's whole foods we're talking about. So yeah, to find a source of protein devoid of fat would be pretty hard to do. Chicken breast, maybe. You know, you can go down the line, but whole food, we already have that combination. That's what I'm talking about. If you use a protein powder, not even thinking about whey, by the way, that's insulinogenic, as you know. So let's say devoid of the whey, a protein powder, your 8 or 9 essential amino acids, yes, you will spike it. Your glucose will go up. That's an easy thing to do. That's 100% of everybody. So not a triathlete or anybody across the board. Don't know about type 1s. I haven't tried it with type 1s. I'm not quite sure. I think I would. But what I'm saying is that's the form of the food. And that's a big point in terms of us looking at this larger context. So if we're like, you know, then we're back to supplements. Then we're about, well, what supplements do you have? What kind of protein thing do you have? No, let's drop it. This isn't where our metabolism evolved from. It evolved from eating whole foods. And that's part of it. It goes back to, it echoes the Joan Iflin of processed food addiction. But if we cull that out of our diet, a lot of things would disappear. I think we can both agree on that. But specifically, when people get into, I just have my smoothie protein drink, you know, I can tell that their insulin's going to be, well, their glucose and their insulin's going to be zooming up without a doubt. And I want to ask them, why are you doing that? What's the point here? How efficient did you make your life? You saved yourself, I don't know, I reach in, I take last night's leftover and I'm good at a couple minutes later if I'm snacking. Bacon is a minute or two. So I don't get that. So that's a different issue. So the form of the protein in whole foods is a big difference, absolutely. So my premise is, and me, and my results, is that yes, whole food, be it ribeye, be it bacon, be it chicken, be it fish, be it, if I left anything out, those general categories, you know, you will see your glucometer go up moderately relative to you having, obviously, a donut, extreme difference. Let's be more realistic. A person who's having a steak and has it with potato, well, that's going to be a big bang up. So what you eat it with and the predisposing glycemia, what was their number before they started munching on that whole foods? That's a driver too. That's a big factor. So shaking that out, and you might say, well, the person was a type 2. Now they're not. They're back here. You know, they're now with normal blood glucose, maybe 100, 110, maybe 90-ish. They're coming down. So they're going to get less of a bang on the glucose after they ate whole food protein than they would have otherwise. And so that's a big difference for me. So once we get into all those little medical food products, I think the big, lack of a better description, bogus part of that presentation is that it's too refined. We're still back dealing with a very refined food. And even if it was all protein, it would still kick up the glucose without a doubt. It would be hard to differentiate that from pure sugar, I'm sure a little bit, but that's how the form of the food makes a big difference. So when we do talk about protein, that's a researcher talking about working with specific outcome. It's not a real life environment if we didn't get to these contrived products now. You know, unless we have a specific deficiency driving a specific amino acid need, it's bogus to be having that kind of product. You know, it's not leading us in a good way. So that was my point.
You know what, I think you and I are completely in agreement with everything you've said, because if you use, and this is really my objection, I think in the ketogenic movement, and this is what I love about a guy like Sean Baker, we really have to get away. There are two words that I absolutely hate in what we talk about. The first word is the word cholesterol, and to describe LDL. LDL is not cholesterol. And the second one is to describe a ribeye as protein. And a lot of people do. A ribeye is the quintessential protein-fat combination that human beings have eaten for a long time. However, here's the thing, Carl, and I think you know this, is that sadly, by far the majority of Americans are on a super low-fat diet, And a lot of the vegan vegetarians get almost no fat in. They may get a few oils in here and there, and usually it's crappy oils. But those are the folks that eat what I call unprotected protein. And whether it's a supplemental protein or a plant-based protein or a turkey breast, I mean, Americans go to ridiculous lengths to remove fat from food because of our intense lipophobia. So we strip chicken sales have gone through the roof. Beef sales have gone way, way down. You can talk to Peter Ballester about that. But they're eating more chicken, more turkey, more of the lean protein. And it's that group of people that I'm concerned about, because in my office, and I know you have the same with your patients, most people in 2020 can understand that sugar may be problematic, whether they understand all carbohydrates are problematic. The Joe Nestlin thing, junk food, sugar, that kind of thing, probably problematic. But most people are still petrified of fat. And I mean, all you need is, I'm going to use this word out there. No, you know what? A gentleman and a scholar like Dr. David Katz, the esteemed vegan nutritionist from New York, they promote a horror of you're about to have a heart attack as soon as you look at a piece of fat. And yet those are the folks that published a diet list that put the ketogenic diet at the bottom. So the reason I put that out as a warning is that don't be afraid to eat fat. You and I are in complete consensus that a ribeye steak, a piece of dark meat chicken with a skin on it, bacon, that's God's combination or nature's combination of healthy protein and fat. And in fact, I'm in agreement with Ben as well, is that when he did that talk at Low Carb Denver, that last slide was fill all your calories with fat, have the protein. My warning is for people who are consuming pure protein rather than animal flesh. And I know it's not nice to talk about animal flesh because poor Bambi, but so we kind of dumb it down by saying plant-based instead of vegan. We dumb it down by saying protein instead of the muscles of animals. But I think you and I are in consensus there, but that was the frame of mind that I was coming from. And I think you're in agreement. You just said so, that when you eat pure protein experimentally or as a ultra lean diet, it does affect blood sugar, and blood sugar ultimately, slight elevations in blood sugar triggers an insulinogenic response, which gets rid of ketosis. So I'm not sure you completely come out of ketosis, but it certainly is something that lowers those numbers. And that's why I think there's more consensus with us than disagreement. But it is critical to put the fat is good message out there and get rid of lipophobia.
Absolutely. I mean, for both of us, we obviously have to share this vocabulary about macros, but for my particular job with the people that I see is that the question in my mind is, how can I get their buy-in to make a change in their life? And the macros is a place to start because it's kind of I hate to say it, but sort of hyper simplistic, but there's a lot of value to that way of looking at it. And so I go a little further and look for nutritional deficiencies because speaking of vegans, there's a woman who's a vegan, really wanted to get into the ketogenic diet, at least she saw something I posted and I said, all right, yeah, sure. I don't think it's going to work for you. And she said, but let's do testing. So first thing I did was carnitine. They were and it happens, this is before that lecture, by the way, Ben Bickman, and that made a difference. And so that was just sort of a quintessential, obvious sort of choice to make in that particular context, but you can go further. And as Doug knows, part of my question for all this, when we hear about ketogenic diet only has success for 50% of the people that, have tried it. And I spent a couple of days up with Dr. Westman and I got to know a lot of conversations and see how he does it. And we had part of this conversation at the last conference in Boca. It's like, so why is that? I, like Doug, feel it should be for 100%. So you rule out inborn errors of metabolism, all the special cases, and we're dealing with what we think are somewhat normal. Why is that? And then we listen to Steve Finney says, well, it's lack of adherence / compliance. And that's actually Dr. Westman's answer too. I don't buy that. I mean, I agree with you.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to say,
I'll always keep quiet for agreement. There you go. But it's like, so, you know, where do you look and what do you, and that's been part of my frustration. I found a lot of good things, but if I can get the buy-in by saying, I'm going to make your, and my analogy is this, I own a parking lot and I've given it free for 100 cars for the last couple of months. And I finally show up and say, 9 o'clock tomorrow, you all got to be out of here. I'm, you know, you had it, but now I'm going to do something else with the parking lot. So 9 o'clock in the morning, I show up, half the cars are still there. And, you know, I've given them all this and I go, I'm almost furious. I'm thinking now I've been taken advantage of. People are taking it granted of my generosity. And I walk up to the first car and I see these people are still sitting in their car. I go, why are you still here? And as I get closer, this person happens to be a guy, cranks down the window and he has a flat tire. Another one has a pothole. Another one has steam coming out of their car, out of their hood. Well, they're all things they need to take care of before they can even think about leaving the parking lot. It's like, these are the easy things, perhaps easier things. And so if I look at this, I can get them back on the road and saying, take care of it. The basic instructions are very easy. Read the signs, you know? And that's how I look at the ketogenic diet. But so what are the easy things? The low-hanging fruit are for deficiencies. Low-hanging fruit
Don't use the word fruit.
Low-hanging.
Sorry.
Aesop's fable. What is Aesop's fable? Anyway, so those particular things, you know, are the things that now I got to buy in. I'll say, you know, it's not that tough and I understand why it's problematic, but look at this. Look what we found. I bet if we took care of this, this, and this, small baby steps, you might say, but really effective, the bang I get out of that buck, meaning the satisfaction and the effectiveness of taking care of the small things now starts to be able to crank the bigger things of, yeah, I'll start looking at the macros, which we can, you know, you can go onto some app like Chronometer or something for babies, for training wheels to get them started. You know, and I do have you know, they need to get a food scale out and find out how much, quote unquote, protein is in a 8-ounce ribeye. You know, some basic eating tools that they don't have. I think the idea, and I think where we are is this generation, or maybe a generation before, is this induced nutritional deficiency, A, by the kind of food we've been eating, and then B, by the medications that we've been on unnecessarily or on too long. And so it's like, that's a mess. So that's the mess I see that is the 50% of the people that really can't make a decent start. They feel terrible. You know, they're depressed, more than depressed. They might, you know, and we know after Dr. Palmer's a couple of talks that, you know, the mental disorders because of choline deficiency, mental disorders because of carbs, you know, high glycemia, it's like, we can pull that back. And suddenly we find this person underneath is like, we can now do something a little more constructive. But that's what it takes. And I think to sort of dismiss, and that's kind of perhaps what the original statement was, now that we've agreed on this, that it said, you know, there's some work to do, small work to do before we get into the bigger thing. You know, we can make this, I don't know about 100%, Doug, but we can get it up into the 90s.
Yeah, well, that was what I was about to say. You know, I mean, when you say lack of adherence, and I mean, I even stepped.
That was Steve Finney, by the way.
Well, yeah. Well, I remember I stepped up to the mic in San Diego and said, "Why is it only 50%?" You know, he was really proud of this 50% that Werther was achieving, and I said, "Well, why is it?" Right. Yes, it's huge, but why is it not bigger? And so, lack of adherence is a very simplistic term.
Absolutely.
And I think what you're saying is that. And I'll go back and defend Eric Westman a little bit, Joe, because what he says is this works if you do it right. But some people, it's not just that they just don't adhere to the thing. They trying as best they can, but they can't. And he's done talks at some of our events where he actually shows a lot of his clinical data and shows where he works through with these patients that weren't having success, and then found out what it was that was causing their problems, and you fix that, and then they start responding.
So the question is that, and that is different for different people. One is simply, you could say support. Hey, right. You didn't quite understand. I'm going to cobble you a little more. Those are the easy ones. You know, their car kind of worked and they can just had to get them out of the parking lot. But others, it's a little more difficult, you know, and you got to go a little deeper because, you know, they're in a place that's almost unreachable. They came to you because it wasn't so much the last hope. It sounded easy enough that it could transform their life. It still is, but you got to look a little deeper. And so when you get into certain deficiencies, especially a lot of these things lead to depression. A lot of these, induced nutritional deficiencies is just
starts with depression, Carl. It starts with depression. It ends with carbohydrate addiction. It doesn't start with, you don't drink excessively and then become depressed. You're depressed and then you drink excessively.
Yeah, very good, very good. And also, it takes looking at, heck, where people are all in a different context, and it has to be recognized. It's like, what are those obvious stressors? Speaking of the addiction model, which I love to look at, especially for carb, and I appreciate your whole theme of this, is that, it's like people can take some stress, but when it gets to be too much, and you speak about kids, when they even, when you think of Nora Volkoff, who's the head of the National Drug and Addiction Agency, is that said, they can do so far. When they get to 5 known stressors, that's it. They're highly addicted, highly vulnerable to addiction, be it carbs, be it whatever their friends are smoking, it's going to go. But so that context of what is their addictions, the PT, the post-traumatic stress disorder of the vets, they come back. One of their things is social isolation, and that's a real torture. It's kind of the torture they use on other prisoners. And so recognizing that and sort of having to take care of that as well. So it ends up being a bigger picture. It's all treatable, I think, but it's very exciting, but it leads you into these other things. I say it's the 50% of the cars still in my parking lot, and how am I going to take care of them? And they are now subdivided. Right.
And so there's a bunch of roadblocks preventing those cars from getting out of the lot in time. And it's the same with those 50% of people that are not responding, is that I feel like if we can identify what that issue is or set of issues are that are preventing them from responding, then they will. And I seriously feel like if we really paid attention to trying to identify and remove those roadblocks, that those numbers would be up in the 90s. And the only reason it would be 90s and not 100 is that there's 10% that we couldn't find the reason that was blocking them. That's true. That if we could, there would be 100. That's how I feel about this.
Absolutely. I'm with you 100%. And we do have that, back to the Dr. Katz comment, 100% agreement there too. It's fake information that's out there that, from these supposed erudite people, well-educated and credentialed, and it just irks me to no end. It's wrong. It's on the face of it, dishonest. It's not misinformed. It's dishonest. The information's out there. And if I was a researcher, they would know this. And so there's just that. It's always going to be in our face. But our numbers are growing. And the theme of this conversation, and also from Adele and her work, was, words matter. So we get a little more specific in what we agree on and don't agree on. There is a lot of keto mythology out there. And I think we're going to nail it down one little piece at a time. We're not on Mars, and it's not mysterious. It's just documenting and moving on and saying, there you go. This can be fixed.
I think there are two major issues for me in terms of what we're talking about here. The first thing is, and this is such an important preamble for me. I absolutely love what Verta Health is doing. I think the science, the program, everything else is wonderful. So what I'm going to say next is not a criticism or indictment. Verta Health is the first group of people that have taken this to the people and done great. But Verta Health is a little bit like selling pea protein burgers, vegan burgers, okay? And what I mean by that is that if you look at why does 100% of people not just sustain Verta Health? The first reason is there's going to be a subgroup, a small group of people who are vegans who are always going to go into McDonald's and preferentially order a vegan burger, an Impossible Burger. Then there's going to be a group of people who walk in there who, because of the marketing, because of the advertising, because of that movie Game Changers, they're going to, let me try this. And they're going to try it, and they may like it, they may not like it, and they may eat it for a while, as long as there's marketing and there's salesmanship. And one of the things that Verta does very well is about coaching, but you've got to pay for the coaching. And as long as you've got that access to that coach, it's a little bit like an alcoholic going to AA. You're going to sustain things for the most part because you got the coaching. If Verta just had a plan and there was no coaching, far fewer people would do that. If Impossible Burgers were sold at McDonald's and there was not this $1 billion advertising to tell people all the time that Impossible Burgers are the same as meat, nobody would preferentially eat an Impossible Burger. And that's the challenge that we're up to that extent. But here's the mistake that we're making. To blame people for not sustaining the eating plan, the ketogenic eating plan, is ludicrous. What we have to do is to figure out why they're not sustaining it. And there are two primary reasons, to my mind, a single primary reason why people are not sustaining it is because of the word diet. Why do you think people, let's say two groups of people, let's say one group of people who take on a ketogenic diet. Why do people go on a ketogenic diet? The majority of people go on a ketogenic diet to lose weight or to deal with their diabetes. The reason most people try a vegan diet is not because they're trying to eat healthier or because they think it's a way to lose weight. Some people do. The majority of people that go vegan, it's because they care about the planet in a misguided way or they care about animal rights. And they are empowered by this arrogance that they will not eat meat because of poor little Bambi. So they're willing to tolerate the austerity of not eating meat because of their intense belief in the structure, in the climate or in animals. So when you offer a vegan a steak, their primary statement is, how the hell can you kill Bambi? That's terrible, you bad person. There's an arrogance to that. When you offer a new ketogenic person a bit of ice cream, oh, I'm not allowed to have that. It's a very deprivational answer. And all you need is deprivation and a little bit of emotional distress, and boom, they're weak, that boundary is gone, and they fail. So all diets fail. 98% of diets fail, whether it's intermittent fasting, whether it's keto, whatever it is, and it's because of the word diet. Diet is intentionally deprivational. And what you don't do is you're not replacing both sides of the deprivation equation. What diets do, ketogenic diet tells everybody what they should do to replace carbohydrates from a nutritional perspective with fat on the carnivore diet, whatever it may be. But they there's not a single diet out there that even Noom or whatever it is, although they spout this out, it's absolute garbage. But what they don't understand is that if you step back and you say, okay, carbohydrates are not food, they become entangled in our food system, and they may have historically been part of human survival, part of the food system, just like heroin is part of, or opioids are part of our pain system. We need we have opioid receptors for a reason, but heroin addiction is completely different. What's happened in the modern era is that we are using sugar and starch as an emotion management system, as a dysfunctional emotion management system. And when you rapidly withdraw those and you do not replace them, it's a little bit like getting an alcoholic to quit drinking without having a new standard. So the relapse is not because of the diet, or it is because it's a diet, it's deprivational. It is because there's no form of emotion management replacement. And I think more and more we have to look at a ketogenic diet or ketosis. We've got to look at the deprivation of sugar from the mental health side. And the last thing I'll say on this, the last comment I'm going to make on this is that carbohydrates are unique in the addiction world in that they leave two deficits, a food deficit as well as an emotion management deficit. All other addictive substances and addictive behaviors are one-to-one. It's the removal of the drug and replacement from the emotion management. But the key thing about carbohydrates is most people become abusive of carbohydrates before they're a year old. Before they even know that they're human, before they are a year old, most kids are exposed to chronic, excessive carbohydrates, whether it is because very, very few women wean their children at 4 months or 6 months onto meat. They wean them onto fruits and onto these slimy little bottles of pure sugar, or they formula feeding their babies on baby milkshakes. So even though breast milk is healthy, the weaning formulas are high in sugar and low in fat. So we connect those babies, possibly even in utero, to sugar. You only start smoking at the earliest, at 8 to 10, most people 12 and older. Very few people start vaping before middle school. There are some, but almost every child in America is sugar tolerant, sugar abusive before they're a year old. And that's a huge threat to our society. But why the hell should I develop an effort-based emotion management system if I've got immediate solace from this highly ubiquitously available, highly addictive substance called carbohydrates? One of the keys along that line, and I know I said I was going to stop here, but is that drugs give you instant gratification, instant reward for a price to be paid on the back end.
Absolutely.
Anything that is part of a healthy emotion management system requires effort. You do the spend up front for the reward on the back end, whether that's going for a walk, whether it's singing, whether it's praying. You put the effort in and there's a return on that investment on the back end.
So, Rob, what you're talking about is deferred gratification. They learn deferred gratification. They learn
exactly
support.
Right.
So
right.
If looking back, it's the support that needs to be around that child, or if we're learning a new pattern, but it's deferred gratification. And then you can go right to the dopamine. There was high and now it's low. In what I've learned in the last couple of months is that, so on the low side of dopamine, which you can actually measure, and so it sort of speaks to a history of a higher dopamine, there was something out there that was triggering, and you can find that out in the history if you're just starting from the blood work, is that it disconnects the frontal, low dopamine is low connection to the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, where behavior control comes from, where reflection comes from. So this lack of, it perpetuates itself into just the opposite of deferred gratification, immediate gratification. So having to back away, learn, and do some hard work, as you say. I mean, there's some hard work in life. It used to be called discipline, but we don't do that word anymore. It's just is. And you have to do a kind of a boot camp approach. But one of the features that I think you're talking about, I like the idea that you're talking about emotional management control, is the fact it's better if there's a group of people as opposed to a one-on-one. So the difference of seeing a patient across the desk as one-on-one, they're siloed. They're just, we have this conversation. It might be good. It might be influential, but it's just one. They don't really see where they are other than they see other people out in the waiting room. When they come in, you can do this online, certainly with 4 or 5, and they get to know each other in the cloister of privacy and look at each other's labs and see the similarity that maybe they're probably all overweight, they're kind of relieved, but also they've learned a lot from looking at other people's blood work, of other people's stories. So it doesn't have to be 12 or 14 or 100. That speaks to a different sort of model, but more than one is very beneficial. Learning from others is really reversely transferable in a funny way. So that tribe aspect, however small, is just that. What a waste.
Human connection is what you're talking about.
Right.
Yes. But
absolutely.
Carl, can I talk? If you don't mind, I'd like to switch to something completely different, which I think is a critical. But this is a critical part. If we circle back to the protein side, and a guy called Dan Quable up in Canada who has just done great things up there, and I shout out to him. And he's just a fat guy who's really found a way to change. He brought this up to me, and I think it happened with me as well, is one of the issues I have with a ketogenic diet. He's quite right. My whole mantra is we don't talk about calories, because once you go back to eating fat, there's enough processes in the human body to control how much we eat. But one of the issues I have with a ketogenic diet is the difference between a fat-fortified meal, which is your ribeye steak, protein with fat that God or nature made, and the degree to which some people, when they're discussing ketogenic diets, give complete free access. In fact, encourage people to consume massive amounts of fat. And the distinction that I make is between fat fortification, which is a natural amount of fat in the food that we eat, and fat overloading, which is putting bunches of oil in coffee and adding globs of butter to your food. Ultimately, and this is just such a dichotomy for me, especially for the weight loss community, ultimately it is about calories. And even though fat gives us satiety, if you eat very quickly, you can consume an extraordinary amount of fat at 9 calories per gram before you recognize those signals. So Dan said to me, we had this kind of discussion, just like we're having with a protein, about, he said, no, calories should count. And he's absolutely right. You shouldn't count calories, but you need an awareness of caloric load when you fat overload food. And I think the ketogenic diet is very difficult to monetize. And a lot of the people that are monetizing the ketogenic diet are doing so by adding fat to the food that we should be eating. And I've got to be delicate about this, but I don't. We've just got to be super careful about fat overloading. Now, if you're an Olsen twin, yes, eat as much as you fat you can because you don't have any to give. But certainly if you're trying to lose weight,
Yeah.
eat your fat, but your percentages should be good. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Carl.
No, I think that, you sort of step back into processed foods, once you start contriving things by putting things on top. I guess the butter is not processed, but what I've seen in terms of experience now is that I think for the first month, first month or 6 weeks, when people start, they really have to be conscious of having their fat. And so when they're coming from, let's say they're coming from the SAD diet, standard American diet, they're going to go, I really got to eat all that fat. This doesn't make sense. I go, trust me. So for 6 weeks, I go, we got to box your metabolism in to have the shift. After that, your fat need is going to disappear. You're going to just have satiation with the ribeye. We're using that as an excuse, whatever. And that's going to come naturally. So these fat bombs talk about an errant, what do you call that, industry. It's unfortunate. But saying that's such a basic lesson to get them to like fat again. So we're going to go fill the fat. If you want to use Ben's slide on that, get the fat in there. After that, there's going to be a natural homeostasis that sort of just disappears. And they go, gosh, I haven't added, oil or butter on my meat in the longest time. And that's actually a minor thing. I think it's the biggest offender is the fat coffees. They go,
yeah, we're not drinking. We shouldn't be. Then it turns into a meal. You turn your coffee into a meal. So I think we just have to be cognizant of that. And I think you and I are on the same page there. But it's interesting that I take care of a lot of patients who do extraordinarily well and they stall out. And often the stall is because they're still fat overloading their food. And for a while, their bodies can compensate when they're enormous. But once they've lost a lot of weight, there's a very delicate balance, and you really have to shift that balance on the caloric load. So I don't like to count calories at all, but I want people to be aware of how much fat they're actually adding to their food. Frying some eggs in butter is fine, but don't add a slab of butter to that egg. And I think I've personally been guilty of that myself, is that I've given myself, as a fat guy, we always want that visceral effect of eating as important as the it's the placebo effect as the sugar itself. And sometimes we give ourselves an allowance that, fat's fine. Now, biologically, it's okay, but if my metric is the scale, that's problematic. Right. And I think that's an important consideration. And I know that, Doug, you're probably going to release this, and I just wanted people to know that, because that's something we haven't talked about around very much. And I think
it's very important. And you talk in some of our previous talks, you talk about eating sequentially, where I always used to think, okay, people that have their epistat is just broken. It's been broken for 50 years or whatever. Now they want to change, and it maybe takes time to heal, and that's why they're not able to recognize those signals of satiety. But the more I listen to you, the more I still think it's possible that some people's are broken, but most of the time, it's really just that they're eating too fast. And that because it takes a while, I think you mentioned something like 20 minutes or something for those signals to start reaching the brain. So eating the way you describe, it takes a lot of effort and discipline or whatever to do it like that. But if you just, which is putting a big plate in the middle of the table and then dishing yourself up small portions onto a side plate, eating that, and then deciding, am I still hungry? Because that takes time. And I think if people don't have the self-discipline to go through that whole rigmarole, as long as they do what you say and be aware of the fact that they need to be cognizant of how much they are eating, because in the end it does count. And so slow down. Eat slowly, eat slower. Have like I do sometimes, I leave a bunch of stuff on my plate until it goes cold because I'm talking too much. But in that way, it's like I look down and think, shit, am I really still hungry? Do I really need to finish what's on this plate?
I think there's a couple of things. I think when you're coming away from carb-centric standard American diet, you do have this sort of immediate, you still have that part that's immediate gratification that goes to food. And when you start to change over that, you're changing that behavior, but more than you're changing that behavior, reconnecting to that part of the brain. There really was, I think I would call it a pathology that they had that you're changing, and gradually you're getting a more thoughtfulness. So if they're thoughtful, and we call it meditative, about what they're eating, then that's really, they're bringing in the front of their brain, and that's a big deal. So it's less about being spontaneously scarf and no, have smaller. And so that's a thoughtful plan. It's a deferred gratification. It's a learned thing to have. Having said that, I will say when I've gone to your conferences that you do have enough fish, meat, and chicken, you know, I go, that's all I have. And for lunch, I just have 2 meat sticks up in my room with a cup of coffee. We do put a little collagen in, and I put a little C8, and I am good. And every time I've come back, those are the only conferences when I come back, I've leaned up in the 3 days I've been away. You know, I go, so I don't eat this way at home, which I thought I did mostly, but it's a part of, I'm totally satisfied. You know, I great conversations at dinner, of course, you know, but you eat enough, you talk, and it's done. And, but I think at the beginner's role, that beginner's mind, almost like a Buddhist orientation, is that they need to have portions and they need to have sequence is certainly part of it. But what they're really talking about is the mental reconnection. I mean, all this is just exterior to create that interior change, specifically dopamine to the prefrontal cortex. But it's really interesting, however you look at it, it's serving the same purpose in the end.
Yeah, and
I
since
think,
you brought...
Doug, sorry, just to recap on your point, the word I use is that human beings are trained to eat preemptively. Because there is no feedback control when you eat carbohydrates, because carbohydrates aren't essential to human survival, we have to have a mathematical formula about how much it's okay to eat. And that's called a portion, and it's based on calories. So human beings, when they're hungry, they decide in their heads how much they think they need. It's called preemptive eating. And then they put that food on their plate and they start to eat it and they finish it. And very often that's overeating, particularly when there's carbohydrates there. And the parallel to that is how stupid, and I use that word in a very quiet, careful, how dumb it is to manage diabetics preemptively. And that's how endocrinologists, the entire management of diabetics by most endocrinologists is preemptive management. They tell them, eat this amount of carbohydrates, and then they've got these tables that they look up to see how much insulin they have to give themselves preemptively based upon the carbohydrates they're going to eat. That is ludicrous. The right way to do it, as Doug said with eating sequentially, is eat until the signals from your body tell you, I'm full, and then stop eating. And the way you do that is to put the food in the middle of the table and go back and forth, and it slows you down. The way to treat a diabetic is, first of all, without a carbohydrate load, but secondly, let them check their blood sugar. Let them look at the CGM. And if the CGM starts to go up, put yourself on a sliding scale where you're dosing according to your CGM, not dosing preemptively based on what you're going to eat. And that's the way you avoid, because every diabetic's petrified of lows. Well, if you overdose insulin, if you screw up your calculation, or you don't get all that food in, or there's something with your gut, or you throw up, you're screwed. Whereas if you dose according to the CGM, you're in great shape because you give yourself just enough on a sliding scale to manage your blood sugar. Exactly the same way when it comes to eating. When you start to feel full from eating fat and you stop eating, irrespective of whether it's 6 ounces of your steak or 20 ounces, that's not preemptive eating, that's feedback eating. And you're listening to the signals from your body that says, I've had enough, rather than I think I should have this amount.
Yeah, and so I was just going to chip in something random there, was just because a shout out for the Boca Raton Marriott chef, because Carl brought up the meals and the dinners, and he just did such a fantastic job there that people could just go and dish whatever they wanted and never be concerned about what was in it or whether it was keto or whatever. So
no, it was tremendous. It was tremendous. So to speak the way things are, you know, when you line up and we have the panel when it's about 2 hours and you bring in the questions, it comes to that sort of camaraderie. It's a great closure because you're intimate with the people you've learned who are left and right and front and back and all these different people. And now you're sharing each other's questions. And so there's a dynamic there that is very helpful to learning. You learn, I didn't think of that question. I didn't think of that question. So it might be me and it's kind of like the 1 patient versus 4 patients. It's amazing. You have a multiple, which is geometric, not linear, right, in terms of. And I think it's,
you know, and I mean, I'm constantly thinking about how I can do things better, but so far that panel has always been a really popular thing and it's worked out well. The only, and the thing I think we've got to look at it is that, okay, it's the same as people come up and I make these rules about Q&A, right? And they have to ask, if it requires a backstory in order to ask this question, this is not the right place to ask that question. You need to ask that question of the speaker at dinner, where you know, or come to me and say, I have this question, and if it's a really big question, then I'll get, you know, you guys on a podcast and ask a question and have an hour to answer it.
Agreed. It's just the arbitrary enforcement, Doug.
The only problem with that concept, Doug, is then you get some idiot coming up there and saying protein turns to sugar.
Exactly, and then you're screwed, right?
Then you're screwed, yeah.
Yeah, and you're stuck with a podcast or whatever this
is. Exactly.
Yeah.
Because what we've just done today is the backstory.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's who you are.
But that was the whole point, is that wasn't the right environment to continue that conversation, but it needed to be continued, and so we've had it here. And you know, it's always dangerous to pitch people against each other who have differences of opinion, but I kind of felt like you two guys had enough, were respectful enough that this would work out. I even always still said, look, I'm going to record it and we'll see what happens, right? If it turns out well, I'll publish it. If it doesn't, I won't. Yeah. So you still never know, but I'm really glad it turned out this way. I feel like it was hugely valuable. It's going to be a great episode, and I really appreciate you guys agreeing to do it. It was awesome.
Absolutely.
No, there's a lot of clarity. I think that's the key thing, is that it helps to clarify things. And, you know, I said we're all on the same page. One comment about that, Doug, though, is what was so cool about talking about this is how under different circumstances the body behaves. And especially how the hormonal interrelationships change depending on different circumstances, type 1, type 2, insulin resistant, athlete. And I think as people that give guidance, we have to be cognizant of every one of those arenas. And we really have to be empathetic to what the needs of our people are, rather than of the person sitting in front of you, rather than being the white coat expert telling people what they have to do. And that's more and more what I've realized in my own practice, is that to tell someone what they should do versus finding out what someone is capable of doing is so important, because so many people tell the diabetics, here, you've got to test your blood sugar 4 times a day, you've got to eat this. Less than 25% of diabetics in my office ever check their blood sugar, despite the fact that their doctor has told them so many times to do it. There's a disconnect, and it's a lack of empathy about taking some poor guy who's just found that he's type 2 diabetic. Now he's got to go and stick needles in his finger several times a day. We've got to be able to hold the hands of patients. And I think when we talked about sustainability, a large part of it is how we, Carl, myself, you, how we relate to people and how we convey that message. Stay within what the person is able to do rather than what I think they should do. And that's so difficult.
Yeah, I think that's a critical takeaway from this. And that is so important in everything we do. And then we were just talking about, you know, the whole 50% thing and why people fail. And I think that's the reason, is that not enough.
One commonality, Doug, by the way, of your speakers, and certainly Rob, these are people who ask questions. You know what I mean? There's followers and people who ask questions, and certainly we need to know certain rules. And so we all need to follow to some extent. But I think what really strikes the audience, they really enjoy listening to it, is it's the person who's speaking is really trying to answer their own questions. It's like saying, these are the problems I've been working on. This is what I've been seeing. This is what I think I know. This is what I've learned. It's such a delight to hear that kind of presentation. And Rob, you do that a lot. And you come up with your own sort of really nice way of presenting things in that way, that idea, but it's because you're answering your own questions, the way I look at it. You know,
I learned so much. Like, I've learned so much from this interaction. Not only do I learn facts, but I also learn method, and I learn how I may have been misunderstood by. It's so obvious to me, people don't. So all of those things. This is not just factual learning; it is humanistic learning, and that's what I love about it. I've grown so much as a human being through this process, and the respect I have for the two of you and the humility that we have toward each other makes this such a positive way to grow and to learn. And hopefully people listening to this can witness that as well and put their arguments on. I always tell my patients this: bring your defenses down. I'm going to give you for free a little virtual bag. Put all the information into that bag and take it home with you. And every few hours, dip into that and take another thing out and process it. And in 3 days' time, you'll understand what we talked about. And I'm going to do the same with this discussion. I'm going to process it. And that's going to be such a big deal.
Likewise.
Awesome, guys.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. Thanks, Doug.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to an episode of the LowCarbUSA podcast. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/LowCarbUSA.